discussion of the internal control plan. Mr. Executive Director, are you looking for a motion here, or is this an update?
I would seek approval, or I guess approval of the authorization opportunity.
Thank you. Please proceed.
So for some context, as the chairman indicated earlier, the request or consideration from the commission today is to consider and hopefully approve the contract with the firm Ernst & Young to help us and the commission develop an internal controls plan. So some background as far as why this would be necessary is first off, because I think it is good practice, but also because state law requires it. So the Cannabis Control Commission would be required through the Comptroller's Office to maintain an internal control plan and share that plan or policy across the entire agency. For context, internal controls are the policies, procedures, and techniques that mitigate our risk. It's a high-level department-wide summary of risks and controls for all business processes. And it's something that obviously we continuously monitor and update, and again, as I indicated, communicate throughout the entire agency. We've worked pretty closely with the Comptroller's Office to date. I'm confident that our internal controls as of now are sufficient. This will help us, I think, develop and maintain a best practice, but also make sure that it's commission-specific and not a kind of boilerplate or template approach. This process is something we manage through our Chief Financial Administrative Officer, Adriana Campos. She began consideration with the Comptroller's Office last fall, really not long after she arrived, and I think has worked with them again to date to consider implementing something as kind of a stopgap approach, but again, really desired to enter into an agreement eventually with a firm, in this case Ernst & Young, to facilitate something for the commission specific. The advantage here is working through the Comptroller, we're able to identify a statewide contract that has a number of different firms. It's not a process we've used very much to date, but it's something I think we will leverage moving forward from an efficiency standpoint. So statewide vendors are pre-vetted and reviewed by a series of departments across Massachusetts, and then gives us a list of vendors from which we can solicit responses from. So in this case, we issued a request for responses, an RFQ, which called for development of this internal control plan. Again, there were a number, I think it was about 8 or so vendors that are on that list. One responded, one firm is Ernst & Young, and we did meet with them, again, Adriana, as well as our Chief Technology Officer, our Chief People Officer, and really the departments it would touch across, reviewed the time frame as well as the proposal, and did deem them to be a responsive vendor, but also someone we would be interested in partnering with. The reason I'm bringing it to the Commission for consideration is really the authorization of the value of that potential contract. As I indicated, the statewide contract is an efficient procurement process, but because it is a contract that would hit us this fiscal year, I want to make sure the Commission was aware of it and would consider it. So the authorization I would seek would be to enter into a contract to develop internal controls with Ernst & Young for an authorization not to exceed $150,000. Again, that's something that was proposed in response to the procurement we issued on the statewide contract. Why I say not to exceed is because largely it's going to be an hourly rate contract, and so there's obviously a potential that it could come in less than that, but I want to make sure there's a cap as far as where we could go. Within that internal contract or internal controls process might also be an opportunity to develop SOPs around cash handling or financial matters. As you know, we're taking revenue from a variety of sources. The majority of our payments have been electronic. There have been some checks. That check is processed through a lockbox mechanism through Bank of America. The same practice has been installed over at the medical use of marijuana program. I want to make sure we have good practices around that. So developing SOPs is another opportunity we may have with this contract, but again, would be within the parameters of not exceeding $150,000. And of course, happy to take any questions you may have.
I agree with so one question, obviously, this is a non-trivial amount of money. It is in the budget?
It is.
And second, it's not clear to me, are you asking for authority to negotiate with the intention of coming back with a final contract for approval, or are you asking for something other than that?
I would seek your approval of the authorization to commit to up to $150,000 based on the statewide contract parameters.
When we're talking about risks and internal controls, is it purely financial matters or is it agency work?
This particular one would pertain to financial matters, and our process for revenue in, as well as any sort of budgetary matters as well. So it is exclusive to financial matters. That said, I guess a bit of foreshadowing, now having leveraged the statewide contract process a bit, I think it's something we can entertain for other matters as well, including the variety of SOPs across the board. So I think, I guess, again, a spoiler alert or potential tease that there might be more opportunities down the road for us to look at an agency-wide approach to whether it be risk or other just SOPs that might be necessary. So, but this one in particular is relative to financial.
Also, I just want to thank you and Adriana because this memo was very well written and it preemptively answered a lot of questions and concerns we had.
She gets full credit.
Other questions or comments? Okay, then if I heard you correctly, Mr. Executive Director, I'd like to ask for a motion to authorize the Executive Director to enter into a contract with Ernst & Young under the state contracting authority that you referred to develop an internal control plan subject to a limit of no more than $150,000 of expenditure by the Commission. Let the Chair, Commissioner Flanagan made a motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Doyle. All in favor? Let the Chair, Commission ask you to approve that, and again, my thanks for bringing this matter to our attention and for developing a plan to proceed, so thank you very much for that. Last agenda item, as I mentioned, is a discussion on social equity and where we are and do we need to do things that we're not currently doing. Commissioner Pyle asked for this discussion. I welcome it. I think it's a very important discussion to have and a very important matter. Commissioner Pyle also asked if she could set up the discussion by going through a few slides, and delighted to have her do that. So let's start with that and then we'll get into the discussion. Commissioner Pyle?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank my fellow commissioners for reading my letter and for taking the last couple of weeks to chew on these ideas in advance of this discussion. So I have 3 slides to proceed the discussion. I'd like to start with why we need a course correction and what specifically I mean by course correction. So first, a review of the legal mandates. So for the benefit of the public, let's recap. The enabling statute that created the commission requires us to do 5 distinct things that no other state agency regulating cannabis has been tasked with. As I read these 5 items, you will see that the issue here is far broader than just the capital SE social equity program. It's more of a vivid picture of what this industry should look like as envisioned in the law. And I'm going to read them first and then go back and discuss the data that we have on each one. So first, the law states that we must prioritize review and licensing decisions for those applicants who promote economic empowerment in disproportionately harmed communities. Those applicants are now known as econ empowerment applicants. Secondly, the law states that we must ensure the meaningful participation of people of color, women, and veterans in the workforce, and also ensure the meaningful participation of companies owned by those groups and by farmers. Third, the law states that we must ensure the meaningful participation in the cannabis industry of communities disproportionately affected by the enforcement of previous drug laws, now known as equity program participants. Fourth, the law states that we must review the participation in the industry by these groups and by state geographic region, compile the data, study the discrimination and barriers to entry, and then take remedial measures as necessary, including recruitment, training, and outreach. Fifth, the law states that we must make recommendations to the legislature on reducing or eliminating barriers to entry, including access to capital. So, looking at all of those 5, and thinking about how each of us has pointed out, when we're doing something novel that no other state has ever done, we will collect data, examine it, make adjustments as necessary. So now is one of those times. Going back through each of those 5 in turn, first, econ empowerment applicants, we did implement as the law required that we would prioritize their review. However, it had no practical effect because as of now they haven't applied. And I will take full ownership of that as having designed that program. Secondly, meaningful participation of these diverse groups in terms of both employment and ownership. In terms of employment, you can see the statistics in each slideshow. So earlier today, you saw we have a workforce that as of now is 72% white, 6% Latino, 4% Black, 67% male, and 32% female. However, I feel confident that as our connector and equity programs launch and we begin to enforce licensees' efforts to implement their own diversity plans and positive impact plans, that those numbers will change based on the path that we're on. We'll continue to monitor that every meeting. In terms of ownership, there are two sets of data that we have now. They're both bad. The first is certified minority-owned or women-owned businesses. So certified means the company has been vetted by the state supplier diversity office. So basically it's ensuring that the business is owned by whom they're saying it's owned by. It's not a front. So the numbers of those certified minority-owned and women-owned businesses are close to 0 in terms of what we've licensed. Now we also have a set of self-reported numbers. So if a company is applying, they can self-identify as one of those groups. So I have those numbers. I want to thank Mary Alice Gill for getting those numbers from us. They're not on the slideshow. Out of 112 licenses, there are 2 minority-owned, 9 women-owned, 3 veteran-owned, 3 LGBT-owned, and 5 self-reporting as 2 or more of those categories. Now, the third and fourth requirements are for us to do the study, find the barriers, and build programs that address those barriers. I say we are ahead on this one because we built in the programming from the beginning. I think anticipating that it would take some time. It's probably taken longer, I think, than any of us have anticipated, but we did start that whole process in advance. The study of the barriers to entry and the diversity in the industry is ongoing. And I also know that every commissioner has been working toward various measures to address barriers to entry from the beginning, including Commissioner Flanagan's work with disproportionately impacted communities across the state, the chairman's work creating relationships with banks and investors, Commissioner Doyle's work with farmers, Commissioner McBride's work recruiting and training pro bono service providers for small businesses, and more. I would say that my current concern is that the equity program was meant to guide the participants through a process that at its foundation should have already been accessible. So we built in low fees, we built in many measures to try to make it accessible. But if there are still systemic barriers, as I said in my letter, I would describe the equity program as trying to help people to cross a bridge that has not been built yet. And so we'll need to continue to be thoughtful at keeping our efforts at identifying and addressing the barriers to entry as holistic and flexible as possible as we move forward. One thing I found incredibly heartening was that at our last meeting, we licensed our first general applicant who was not a priority applicant. That was a woman-owned business. She said that she navigated the process herself. And if we continue to see more of that, then we can be confident that there is a path to guide entrepreneurs along. The fifth requirement doesn't have data attached to discuss. It's just that we need to make recommendations to the legislature about addressing barriers to entry, including access to capital. I think we are well poised to do that with both the information we already have as well as the data from our study. And clearly that's a very important role for us to play. Under new data, you can see I said other states and the federal government are looking to Massachusetts. And there's a million examples of that, but I want to give you one just from the last week that I think is very demonstrative. So the first ever congressional banking hearing took place last week. It was several hours long. Massachusetts was mentioned once, and it was in a line of questioning about whether the current marijuana industry is compounding the racial wealth gap. And the question was, are we compounding the racial wealth gap? And here are some numbers coming out of the different states that are willing to release numbers, Massachusetts being one of those few. And so the statistics were listed, these statistics that we have released. But then the second part of the questioning was, in addition to addressing banking, subject of this hearing, can we prioritize frontline and most impacted communities to get those licenses first so they can recoup some segment of the cost they bear, which is the Massachusetts policy. And I think that demonstrates so well the reason why we need a course correction, because on the one hand, our data is being used to demonstrate that what's being done now isn't enough, but then on the other hand, the solution that's being proposed all across the country is our solution, and everyone is looking to us as the only agency that's been tasked to this, and that has gone further than any other state. So the national dialogue is now stuck waiting for us to figure out how to move forward. I think that the next thing that's going to happen after this conversation, as we flesh out more ideas, as we flesh out the exclusivity that moves beyond just our vote and we put it into practice, that will be the next measure that's being raised, and everything else that comes up today will have an impact far beyond Massachusetts. Lastly, regulatory adjustment period. So I propose that the goal coming out of this meeting today be 5 to 10 concrete, tangible ideas for new solutions that are not already in place or ongoing, that are within our authority, that don't depend on anyone else, and then we can move forward with evaluating those ideas for feasibility and optimization. For the benefit of the public, agencies can't just make changes whenever they want. The timing has to be in big groups of changes. It takes several months. You have to have draft and then hearings and then final regulations. So that's why now is the time to have this discussion, so we can vet the idea, develop it, put it in the draft regulations, and then take public feedback along with everything else we'll be taking public feedback on. And then one last note on timing. Something I see a lot out there is the idea that it's too late, that big marijuana is already here, that they're too powerful, that they've already taken over. And I just want to take a minute to correct that, because no, it is not too late. There are 10 stores open, 9 stores open, less than that. There's going to be 50 stores in Boston alone. There's 0 stores open in Boston. And so this idea that I just keep seeing out there, like, just like coffee, we can't stop Starbucks from taking over. How can a little community coffee shop compete with Starbucks? So first of all, the coffee industry doesn't have a limit of 3 licenses or 3 coffee shops per entity. If it did, it would look a lot different. And then secondly, it's very much in the interest of a wannabe marijuana Starbucks for people to have that perception. And so if you see that perception out there, I encourage you to be skeptical of it. I encourage you to keep attending these meetings and stay on top of what is actually being decided. And so for some proportionality, yes, there are 112 total licenses issued provisionally, and the numbers don't look good, but it's very early and we have a lot of control over what now unfolds. Next slide, please. So I have a suggestion as to the most efficient and effective way to structure this discussion. If it's okay with you, Mr. Chairman, I'll describe that process and then leave it to you to facilitate. So we all have experience working with vulnerable or marginalized populations. Commissioner Flanagan has protected teens with mental health issues and substance abuse disorders. The chairman and I have both been very focused on economic justice over this period. Commissioner Doyle has more experience with medical cannabis patients than any of us. Commissioner McBride has protected homeowners from foreclosures and protected victims of violent crimes. So I think that we are all familiar with centering the groups we are trying to help when we make decisions, and that is the premise of this order. So I would suggest that we start by taking a minute for any of us who is comfortable to talk about, to articulate our vision in which we fulfill our mission statement, focusing on who we're trying to help. And then we move on to the ideation or brainstorming stage in which we generate and agree on 5 to 10 concrete policy ideas. I do have 4 to start with to seed the discussion.
Can you hold on? Let's go through your process first.
Do you want me to just handle that?
Hold on to that, please.
Sure. All right.
Keep going. Thank you.
So those 4 are a start, but I think we should have 5 to 10. I think everyone has had a couple of weeks. I'm sure you all have a lot of ideas that you want to discuss too. Now, the last step, I think, should be to formally ask the staff. Well, let me say first, I would welcome staff input in this discussion now. But I think the last step should be to formally ask the staff, 1, is this feasible? And if so, how would you recommend that it work? And 2, is there any legal reason why we can't do this? So I would say that my 4 ideas were crowdsourced from different conversation, and I have floated them by relevant staff, but I think it's really important that we make that step formal, that there's some weight to it, that we are asking that question in a way where we can give time for it to be thoughtfully considered, and then we can all be presented with the same information. Last slide, please. So to provide a starting point for the discussion, people were very generous with their time. I was able to sit down with people from every department, on the adult use side, hopefully the medical use side too eventually. And just kind of formally ask as a preliminary step, what do you think will help us reach our mandates? I also asked municipal officials, hopeful investors, hopeful entrepreneurs, people from other states, and these are the broad points that came up, kind of crowdsourced, to provide some seeds for our discussion. So first, with regard to our application, we have now technically fulfilled the priority in the law. It seems like a good time to revisit existing priority status and create new priority status, possibly, or statuses based on our mission and goals and the new data that we have around existing trends on participation in the industry. And now that we have new information about the pain points and the barriers to entry in the application, that we consider offering certain groups, equity program participants, and economic empowerment applicants an abbreviated application process in which that would take place before the local approval process, and then the rest of it would take place after the local approval process and the host community agreement. And some marijuana forward, equity focused municipalities have specifically expressed interest in putting aside spots for those participants or working collaboratively with us to create a pipeline and make our state and local processes more efficient and more equitable. As we continue to study and get more data on barriers to entry, some will be in our control and some will not. So we should have a formal process in place to discuss and issue recommendations for changes in state law to allow us to meet those mandates in the law. And certainly the law is clear that it's anticipated and expected that we will make those recommendations. Lastly, I think it's important to note that we all recognize that access to capital is an issue. And we should be doing whatever we can to facilitate investment in smaller, more diverse businesses. But also, I want to preemptively address the idea that that discussion is limited to, oh, it costs this much to start a business, we need to raise that much money for each applicant, there's no way we can do it, we're hopeless. I just want to discourage that line of thinking, because I think we have barely begun to scratch the surface of what we can do through policy to encourage investments in these groups that we are mandated to include. I think one reason we haven't seen investment in these groups is something that I'm actually really proud of, which is the integrity of our process makes it unpredictable. And so no one can suggest exactly what's going to happen in our state, and I think Massachusetts is something of a mystery, because if you ask what will happen with a certain aspect, the true answer is the five of us will sit down, and the answer is public health, public safety, government regulation, business, and social justice. What's the right answer? I think we can do a lot to address that information gap, and people are waiting to see before they invest, will we really see meaningful opportunities and encouragement of these smaller businesses? And so if we can use our own tools to create opportunities exclusively for these businesses, to help them address the location search, the local approval process, the other barriers, and ensure that they are trained properly, that they have the ability to access resources, to develop good financial practices, make good hiring decisions, and be compliant, and we're open about that, we can fill that void of knowledge and information. And that's the biggest thing I think we can do to encourage investment without necessarily raising a penny directly for any applicants.
So, first of all, thank you. I appreciate you taking the leadership on the letter, setting up the conversation. Before we talk about how to facilitate the discussion going forward, I'd like to extend courtesy to the other commissioners if they have thought, just in general, on the issues that Commissioner Connell raised.
I have questions about certain ideas, but I don't.
So let's hold those off. Any other comments? To me, before we talk about the process going forward, I would really like to hear from others, if you're comfortable, the premise that it is time to change course, which I think is kind of the first point you made, and I think you supported it admirably, but I think that's something I really, is it time that you feel we need to change course here? Or I would like, as I said, to solicit comments, but I'm not going to force anybody into making comments they're not comfortable doing so.
So I have a couple of comments and I think concerns. First, I appreciate the memo that you had circulated. I think obviously social equity and economic empowerment has been part of the enabling legislation that was intended for when the Cannabis Control Commission was created. You know, we've been talking for over a year, and we often joke about how we started off with 5 people, 5 cubicles, no
Right,
staff,
that's not a-
we did this
that's
on
not a
our
joke.
own. Well, it is now though, because we don't have 5 cubicles, we have 1 million people up in that office that step over each other every day. But multiple times a
58
day.
million, what's the difference?
But, you know, and I think that the work that we have done up until this point has been very genuine in trying to fulfill all of the mandates that we had in our enabling legislation, and also to come up with a mission statement that encompassed that and to really work towards that. My biggest concern, and I have not been shy about saying this for the past year, is that when we talk social equity, it's often in the boundaries of the city of Boston. There are 12 cities outside 495 that are considered social disproportionate areas that I don't think are always participating in this conversation, and if they are, I don't know that, and that's my bad. But I think we have to start to think about social equity as the entire state, and think about what does that look like for the entire state, because what that looks like in Boston is not the same as what it's going to look like in Amherst, or it's going to look like in a city out west. Coming from 50 miles west, I always call it the Boston bubble. Everybody thinks it all happens here, and the truth is that there's 6.3 million people in this state, and there are 6.3 million people that are going to be either directly or indirectly affected by what we do. The first thing that, you know, I say that I was on the Kay Doyle Roadshow for the first 3 months that we were talking about this, and we've been from Lenox to Martha's Vineyard.
Hey, that was, we've traveled around as well.
Well, but I'm saying, like, the trips that we did to go to communities, people didn't understand what they voted for. They didn't. They had no idea. They thought they were legalizing it. They didn't realize what came from it in the municipalities. They didn't understand what that process was going to be. You had people who were in selectman positions, planning board commission positions, that just didn't know what to do. And how many cities and towns had moratorium until December of this past year? So we're kind of in month 2 of my vision of these cities really having to grasp all this, while they've had time to get stuff together and figure out what's good for their community. I don't think that, the one thing I do disagree with in your memo is that I didn't expect more equity applicants this early, because I didn't know how that was gonna work out. And I think that partly the capital issue was a big thing for me. How are they getting capital? People weren't planning for this. People aren't able to save. You know, my question is, are people holding out for delivery in social consumption? I don't know that, and if they are, and they're not applying now because they're waiting for these licenses, which we haven't even approved yet, then that's not our fault. That's not something that we failed at, because they're waiting. And if that's what they're waiting for because there was a lower level of entry, then fine, people wait to do what they wanna do. So I think as we move forward, we have to really from my perspective, take a look at that. Because, you know, everyone tells me, compare this to alcohol. Well, alcohol has, cities and towns have limits on liquor licenses. And how many times have we heard that certain communities don't want more package stores in their cities and towns? Because it's targeted. And so from my perspective, I get very hesitant when we're targeting, and again, 7 of the disproportionately impacted areas are college towns. They're college towns. So when we're saying, okay, let's make sure that these people are involved, let's make sure we get in there, I have a hesitation, because they're college towns. Those students are people we still need to protect. Most of them are under 21. College campuses now, because they have lack of housing, are pushing kids into apartments earlier than when I was in college. You're not spending 4 years in a dorm or 3 years in a dorm. And so I really think that if we're going to do this, we need to take a holistic look at what needs to happen going forward, so that we can make this look the way we want across the state. And I know that most of the time it's my own doing. I say it's Boston bubble, but that's really where we hear from people most. You know, people always have, and part of your presentation is that people should reach out to us, and they have the ability to do that every day. People can email us anytime they want about anything that they want. We have public hearings, we have hearing sessions. You know, I think we've been pretty vocal about trying to do what's right for Massachusetts. And while the rest of the country is looking at us, it's not something new. People have looked at us for healthcare and education and addiction treatment and all kinds of things we've done over the years. They're gonna have to work with the time frame that we're working on. Because I'm not gonna rush this and get it wrong because Washington wants to know what we're doing. Washington has had their time to do their work, and they did not do that. And granted, they're doing it now, but we need to do what's right for the people here. So as we move forward, from my perspective, I think we need to talk about employment more than we have been, and pathways to ownership. I think we need to, yes, people wanna own businesses, I can appreciate that all day long, but coming from a manufacturing city, people started sweeping the floor at 15, and then they were running the R&D program by the time they got there out of school. It was a 10-year process, so we need to start looking at pathways for people to get into this, and manage expectations of what we have here and what we have going forward. So that's my perspective of where I'm gonna take it from, but I appreciate the comments from the other commissioners.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Blackman. I'm happy to go, but for Commissioner Doyle or Brady, if you'd like, as I said, no pressure. Let me make a few comments. First of all, again, I really appreciate Commissioner Title and her passion in bringing this issue to the table. I think it's absolutely appropriate and necessary to have this conversation. Commissioner Flanagan, I appreciate your comments and your passion as well. I'm in the position where I'm not sure that it is appropriate to do a quote course correction at this point in time. I think we're working really hard on this issue, all of us are. As you pointed out, thank you very much for recognizing the efforts that each and every commissioner is making on this. It's hard, it's really hard. I believe we are all totally committed to the outcomes that you were describing, but we're really early in this process. We have 9 stores open. Actually, I guess 9. Hudson did finally open, so we have 9 stores open. I will point out, I can't resist saying this. For those that have been saying, God, this is taking forever, what's taking you so long, why didn't you open 200 stores on day 1? Had we done so, which I don't think is the right thing to do, but had we done so, this problem, it would be too late to solve this problem. So I think the fact that we're doing this the way we are with a relatively gradual rollout, as you pointed out, Commissioner Carroll, does give us time. It's not too late to solve this. So I just wanted to point out that those pushing for 200 stores open on day 1, we might not have had the opportunity to do this right. But we're doing a lot. We do have the social equity program. The RFP is about to be released. The program will start in July. I believe is the time frame. We're doing an orientation program that's going to be staffed by the commission in the April-May time frame. I think those are incredibly important programs. Our applications require each applicant to tell us what they're going to do to assist the commission and the state in reaching these objectives. And I think you've seen pretty much every time a provisional license has come up for review, Commissioner Flanagan has said, I want more detail, I want more specificity, I want more accountability. And I think, my experience with a number of the applicants is they're totally sincere in their desire to help here, but they're just getting started as well. The financing issue to me is the biggest challenge. We can do everything else that we can imagine things we're doing and other things on top of that. If we can't help with financing, it's not going to work. I will say I'm kind of guardedly optimistic. I probably had more of these conversations. I'm certainly not the only person working this issue, but I've probably had more conversations with banks, with charitable foundations, with wealthy individuals, with industry participants. There is a widespread and close to universal desire to help across those groups. Some of them are constrained because of the federal prohibition. Some of them are moving more slowly than I would like. But there's just an enormous amount of energy across those constituencies I just described to try to help deal with the financing issue. There's also state agencies that can help as well, that we're working to try to get them to participate in this. So I think there's an enormous amount of things going on, and I think it is early. So I don't know that I agree with the course correction. That being said, I do welcome any additional ideas, because it's hard, And, you know, I think, yeah, so I'm willing to have a conversation about what else we should be doing. I guess what I'm resisting a little bit is the notion of a course correction, which implies that we're not doing the right thing now. I think we are doing the right things now. I think we have a complete and total commitment across each, I'm not gonna speak for the other commissioners, but I'm 100% certain each of us are totally committed to realize these objectives. And I think we're doing an awful lot. It's just too soon to say what the impact's gonna be. I'm happy to discuss adding things to the list that I just went through of the things we're doing. But I just resist a little bit the notion that a course correction is required. I think it's just way too early to reach that conclusion. I will jump on two things that Commissioner Flanagan said just to support them, because I agree with them both. One is it's got to be statewide. It's just too easy to focus on Boston, and while Boston's the biggest city and the most licenses are going to be there, we've got to make sure that whatever we do is statewide. I think that's hard to do sitting in Boston. So we've just got to redouble our commitment to make sure that what we're doing is statewide, not just Boston. The other thing, I was stunned when I saw the slide that the executive director showed earlier today about the social equity applicants. I had seen the total number of applications we've gotten, but I hadn't seen until you showed them what track people were interested in. And I was stunned. It was, I don't remember, 80% plus that were, you know, interested in the entrepreneurial track. I completely agree with Flanagan, which is that that's a great aspiration, but a lot of people just aren't experienced or ready for that. They're going to have, even if capital was readily available, even if we didn't have the federal prohibition and capital was coming in from all different sides, people that don't have experience are going to have a hard time raising capital. And so the notion of sweat equity, the notion of starting at the bottom, working around, I'm completely supportive of that, and I'm concerned that we have created, and it's our own fault, my own fault, unrealistic expectations that you can just get into this business without any experience. I think that, you know, some people can, but I really think we need to do a better job of encouraging people to be a little bit maybe longer term in their perspective. That, you know, let me get started, get a job, learn the space, get some credentials, get some credibility, and raise capital at some point or become entrepreneurial at some point. I think it's a little bit scary to me that the vast majority of the people that have applied for the social equity program are interested in the entrepreneurial track. I just think that's an unrealistic expectation in any industry, not just the industry we're talking about. So that being said, I'm more than open to ideation, but as I said, I just felt it was important at least to share my perspective, and it's only my perspective, that course correction is not the right, it's not the way I think about what we need to do. I think we need to keep doing what we're doing and then bring in whatever other creative and interesting ideas we have. Because the one thing I know for sure is this is hard. This is really, really hard. I am totally committed, as the rest of us are, to make this work and to meet our objectives and our mandates. It's really hard. So I'll take all the help and all the new ideas I can get, as I think all of us probably would. Commissioner Frank?
So I think I want to just sort of echo maybe some of the sentiments.
That would be the first time.
The chair said, but also to, I guess, I'm not quite sure what the answer is that I have about whether it's time for a course correction or how to kind of phrase that. Because I think that we have, and we always point to the need for data on all of these different things, right? And I think that here is an example where I don't think that we have data that has quite the integrity that I would like for it to have to point out if we have a big problem or a small problem or somewhere in between, and what the specific issues might be. And so I would really like for us to think about, as a first step, and Commissioner Title rightfully, I mean, you know, embeds this right in the slides and the conversation, really developing that data quickly, but, you know, developing that data and doing it through, I ideally like to use like a research entity and some, you know, an entity that does this, like this is what they do. And it's not to say that our research division of two, you know, can't accomplish that task, but I think that in order to really create good, strong data points, we should be thinking about that. I would like for that data to be developed by looking at the individuals who have come into the pipeline And I think that, you know, every week or every 2 weeks, we put up that slide and it's like, you know, it pulls, like it just absolutely is distressing to see 4 economic, right, empowerment, like that's just like every week. We have 93 economic empowerment applications open. 4 of them have submitted 4 packets. 3 of them have submitted 4 packets. 2 have submitted 2 packets. 1 has submitted 6, and 72 of them have submitted no packets. Why? Is it because when we advertise the economic empowerment application process, we said outright, get certified and then hold this, and then whenever you're ready to submit your application, you get to jump to the front of the line. And it can be 6 months from now, or it can be 3 years from now. And but you know, when you think the time is right to submit the application, go for it. I wanna know, is it because people, those 72 applicants are holding that and are trying to figure out, are they, you know, trying to figure out, do I wanna go work in the industry and build up my knowledge and then go and open something? Am I trying to get to capital and they're like real close? Or is it that they know they wanna do it and they aren't quite sure, right, how to get there, and our social equity program with the new curriculum that we're building is gonna be absolutely critical to their success? Or is it that they are like just not, they are facing barrier after barrier after barrier and just can't get over it? So I want to kind of dig into that a little bit and figure that out. I also, you know, wanna kind of see with our social equity applicants, it's kind of a similar thing, like where are those real barriers? We have, you know, I don't wanna call it, it's somewhere between anecdotal and, you know, real specific data about the things that people identify to us as we are all out and about as the barriers, and it's the capital piece, and it's the zoning piece, and the location, it's the negotiations with municipalities, it's, you know, all of these pieces that I would like to kind of see some real numbers kind of associated with that, not only because I think it gives us the scale of whether in fact we are truly failing at this and what we have responsibility for and take ownership of, and what are the things and the ways that we address those problems, and where maybe we aren't failing, but there's something that can be done, or if there's something like we need to wait for, you know, some other act to happen. So I mean, I think that we need to generate a little bit more information to figure out what the issues are, and then I think based on that, what the right direction is to go in to address those issues and do it at a statewide level, and engage in the conversations about how the programs get built out. I'm really impressed by the way that we have addressed, you know, our kind of initial out of the gates social equity program, and then kind of came back and retooled it, because I think that it creates a really dynamic curriculum. I would love for there to be a really great piece about the capital. I'd like to see, you know, about developing that, and I, you know, kind of tried to share some ideas about maybe like possible outreach to do. That's hard nut to crack, but I think that it's something that is certainly worthy of trying to get at, but it isn't just capital. I mean, it is all of these other pieces, and we need to know, but you know, how much to kind of percentage to assign to each of those pieces. You know, we need to really focus, 50% needs to be there because that is a big one, and you know, 2% needs to be here because it's not as much of an issue for everybody. So, there's more.
Thanks, Commissioner.
Everyone's already said something I'd say, so there's no point in repeating it.
Okay.
Why don't we let Commissioner?
Yeah, I was gonna ask Commissioner Tuttle to think about your proposed process, given the comments that you just heard from the other commissioners. I was gonna say that anyway, but thank you for that.
Okay, this is very much a conversation that I wanted to have, so I appreciate them so far. Commissioner McBride, I could not possibly agree more with the idea that the first thing we need to do is have a robust study on the barriers to entry. We did a survey, but that's very different from a research institute that does this, going in, having conversations, doing focus group, doing informational interviews, and really coming back and saying, here are the barriers and here are how they need to be addressed. And I would consider that one concrete idea that's probably the most important. I believe that is already being discussed, but I don't want to say anything prematurely. If I may ask you to comment on it, Mr. Collins?
There's a statewide contract that we can certainly, I think the intention would be to leverage something, a vehicle like that. To Commissioner McBride's point, our research department, I think, would be well equipped to manage something like that, but it would be difficult to ask them to conduct that research themselves, given I think the aggressive timeline they've laid out previously based on the first report. So I can share that I think there's a statement of work or some sort of a scope that's in development right now, and I can confidently say that we've identified a statewide contract that would help us do that, and I think that's something that's underway meaningfully as we speak.
We need to discuss that. I appreciate that the statement of work is being developed. I haven't seen it, and I would certainly like to discuss it, but I'm glad that we at least have a path forward if that's one of the options that we decide on today.
Also, in addition to that, I think that our own in-house outreach, we can try to evaluate and see where we've been and where we haven't been, and how do we bridge that gap. I'm curious as to the types of groups that have asked for our community outreach team to present or to participate in events across the state, where those events are geographically located, and what comes from those events. So I think that's helpful for us internally to see where we need to fill the gaps, especially as we talk about a statewide initiative. I mean, again, we're moving to Worcester so that we can be accessible to people. Our outreach team should be out more than in the communities, making sure that we're connecting with people. So if we can do some type of analysis of that, just for an internal use, and see if maybe we can do more outreach in places we haven't been, that might be helpful.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Commissioner Tucker.
I agree. I think that's a really good, tangible idea to, it sounds like, look at the geographic distribution of the equity applicants so far. It sounds like they are concentrated in Suffolk County, figure out where we need more outreach and then plan accordingly. And I just want to thank you, Commissioner Flanagan, for, from the beginning, making sure that the statewide focus was important, and we are moving to Worcester. We do have 29 disproportionate areas of impact all across the state. And I don't know if I expected it, but the municipalities that are leading are very much in the central and western parts of the state. I did want to quickly address what you mentioned in terms of our expectations, because in my letter, I didn't say that I thought we'd have more equity applicants necessarily. We don't know how many we have moving through the program. What I said is that I think we all expected to see more diversity in the types of license issued. So more micro businesses, at least one co-op. That was the part that I was surprised by, and I would like to see more examination as to what those barriers are.
Yeah, and I apologize for that. I do think that I didn't expect to see that diversity, because I just didn't think people were ready to go. And I think what we're seeing now, conversations that we had in the first year that we did this during our deliberations, was that we wanted to ensure that those smaller entities were from here, and we made sure that they had the priority over that. But in the other respect, I kind of expected some of the RMDs would have been already ready to go, and that's who would come first, and put money in the technical fund that other applicants could then pull from. So it's kind of like the chicken and the egg. What's gonna come first? We kind of need RMDs who have the money to put money in the technical assistance program so that other people can pull from it. But at the same time, we want those applicants to come forward so that they can be licensed, and then we can have greater diversity at the same time. So I think we're kind of in that catch-22, but luckily with 9 entities open and with multiple other entities licensed, hopefully money is being put into that fund that people will then be able to draw from. And then, certainly after this go around in the budget cycle, we'll see what we get from the legislature to help fund all of these different things.
Mr. Chairman, if I may just address this course correction. I heard
I'm
and
sorry.
appreciate everyone's comments, thank you, about the word course correction. And I am certainly fine with, removing those words, and instead, I think your suggestion was adding more actions to the list we're already doing. I fully accept that.
Okay. So you want to propose a couple of
Yes.
additions to the list?
Yes. So, and I already heard, so I have 4 that I'd like to go through now, but I'm gonna add number 5, the robust research study, and number 6, adjusting outreach for the equity program based on geographic diversity. Okay, shall I go through these one by
Sure.
one, Chairman? Okay. Number 1 is, create regulations allowing shared use cultivation and shared use manufacturing space for certain groups of applicants or licensees to address the barriers to entry posed by securing real estate, facility design, and local approval processes. Shared use brings up a lot of regulatory questions, most of which I'm not an expert in, but I did attach a fact sheet on California's shared use facility as a starting point. And I did have some preliminary conversations about whether this is feasible, and I believe it's feasible enough to optimize the idea and ask for feedback from staff.
You want to do this one by one? Yeah, I certainly, I feel expert on the regulatory issues in this as well. I mean, conceptually, it seems like a pretty reasonable thing to pursue, but I would think we'd want to pursue it through the regulatory process that we articulated, so that as we get into developing draft regulations, I would love to see draft regulations developed on that, so we can have a debate amongst the commission. If we agree, publish a draft regulation, get public comment, and public feedback, but I absolutely would love to see that as part of that process, with my opinion personally. Commissioner Brown?
I love this idea. I think that anything that we can do on cost sharing is great. And I think that it's a tangible, helpful way to really try to lower barriers.
I agree. So I think we can, unless I hear otherwise from Commissioner going I think we can ask to direct the staff to develop draft regulations for our discussion as part of the regulatory process that we've already outlined in the first half of 2019.
Sorry, I think Commissioner Bell had the comment, but first I just wanted to clarify that what I was suggesting was not that we move straight to draft regulations, but we instead ask the staff for their opinion on the feasibility and the legal authority on each idea.
Well, okay, that's fine. To me, that's a prelude to get into draft regulations.
Yeah, of course.
So the first step, so I think we're aligned. Commissioner Doyle?
Right, and actually consistent with that comment, because I do think it's a very interesting idea. I do have that food protection background, and
You have that?
food protection background, and I'm happy to
Yeah.
lend the expertise.
I think you
Such that it
just
is.
volunteered.
No,
Your volunteering has
no.
been accepted by the staff.
I think there are folks on our investigations team who bring much more to bear than I do, but I would flag that as one of the larger issues associated with the shared facilities generally.
Okay, so, I think we have a plan, so let's go to the second one, please.
The second suggestion is to revisit existing priority status and create new priority statuses based on the Commission's mission statement and current data examining participation in the legal marijuana industry in Massachusetts. And I would just state that I am personally agnostic on what those new priority statuses might be. There's a lot of different groups that we should be encouraging. I don't know exactly what it should look like. But to Commissioner McBride's point, when the earlier econ empowerment priority applicants applied, many of them were upfront that they were not ready to apply immediately, and we encourage them to apply anyway. Maybe in this case, we can revisit and focus on companies that are ready to go.
So,
Commissioner Doyle?
yeah, my only comment is I think we just have to look at whether or not that will involve us having to go to the legislature based on, the fact that the original priority statuses were set forth in the statute. So we'll just have to examine that issue, which we don't need to do right at this minute. I'm just saying.
Any other comments? Commissioner Brown?
I don't know, I have no idea what the answer is on this. My question is really gonna be about, making sure that we are, what we do, if we do anything on it, that we can do it legally and that we're not upsetting the apple cart in a way that opens us
I'm not quite sure, I think I need some more specificity before I really have a strong feeling on this. I don't know what we're talking about in terms of which groups, what kind of priority. Without trying to dodge it, one thing that came to mind as you were speaking was, isn't this something we would learn about through the study that Commissioner McBride has suggested, and I think identify specific needs of specific groups and then discuss if we need to create priority or other advantages for those groups. I just don't know which groups for what purposes yet, so I have a hard time reacting to this specific request. But I think it's fun, but I would kind of append to the back of the study that Commissioner McBride requested, at least in my opinion. Commissioner?
If I can add some color to it, but not necessarily advocating for any way this would be interpreted. But the way it's written in the law from my recollection was that there were two groups. The first group was making sure that the medical dispensaries had priority to allow for efficiency and to minimize redundancy between the two agencies. And then the second status was to ensure that we were encouraging economic empowerment of the disproportionately harmed communities, which is different from the participation of those communities, right? And so I think that if we were to revisit priority status, we could define economic empowerment differently, perhaps. Again, not advocating for that. We could also look at that pie chart that we visit every meeting that I think makes all of us uncomfortable when we see how few the groups that we're supposed to be including, how few of them there are, but they're there, right? So if we wanted to encourage some of those groups to move to the front of the line and at least encourage them that way, that seems to me obvious.
Right, and I just want to clarify, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman. I don't know the answer to the question I posed. We may have the authority to prioritize other groups. I just literally don't know.
Go ahead, Commissioner Platt.
I think for me, I'm open to revisiting the priority status. I don't know if I wanna create more priority status or new priority status, but the thing that's sticking out for me is, the word participation, because when I think of participation, I also think of all the ancillary businesses, the electrician who's helping to build the building, the people who are doing the build out, the guys providing the lumber, the people coming in and doing the painting and all of that. To me, that's participation. So if these applicants are working with people in the communities who own other types of businesses that may be women-owned or minority-owned or whatever, I think that's participation, and I think that needs to be included in any kind of questionnaire that we're asking. And I kind of equate that to the tax credit that's very controversial in Massachusetts. They think about the actors and they think about the people coming in. Well, someone has to cater, someone has to drive, someone has to provide lighting. To me, that's participation, and I think that, again, from my perspective of where I've been for 20 years on Beacon Hill, the bubble gets bigger. I mean, people are able to participate in different ways than what we might think of. So when we look at the data, I would wanna see how many locally owned businesses are coming in, who provides the food truck for if they have a food truck for the staff, some people do that for lunch, and who provides the water, and who provides everything else. To me, that's gonna make a big difference in the numbers of people participating than what we would normally see as just owners or applicants.
Great point, hard to measure, but great point.
It's not that hard. I mean, if you can look at their vendor list, if people are willing to look at their vendor list.
No, I'm not saying it's possible, I just think you have to reflect some data and that kind of reflecting on it.
But to your point, Mr. Chairman, what you're saying, we have to collect a lot of data that the state of Massachusetts is not currently collecting, because this wasn't an issue 5 years ago. And the fact that, we're asking DPH for numbers, we're asking, OEMS about matrix reports and the run reports for EMS and how many places they're going. We need data from schools, we need data from hospitals, we need data from all over the place that, if you look at the 80 some odd bills that are on Beacon Hill that pertain to this issue, we're asking for all that data. We're asking for the Department of Education to help us with things in education, Department of Public Health. So to your point, yeah, a lot of this is data driven. We don't have that data. And I think, again, to manage expectations, we need data. We would love to have data. We have a research director who craves bundles of data, and if she had it her way, she would be getting all of this in a moment's notice. We just don't have it, and so that's why some of it's going to take time to collect, and that's why this is an evolving industry. We look at Colorado, they're 5 years in, they're starting to stabilize. I mean, we're in year 1. We've got 9 stores open. So I think we need to start to look at responsibly creating policy and regulations with either a scientific background or data backup that we have, and not just because we have certain surveys that are being sent out by different industry members or different, government agencies, but like you said, an actual research think tank that goes out and does this.
Okay, go ahead, Commissioner Chang.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to say what a fantastic idea I think that is, and I should have thought of it, I did not think of it. We are seeing an incomplete picture if we're not including the ancillary businesses. My business was ancillary, it wouldn't be counted as participation under this. And as we collect data on that, we can also adjust our ancillary track in the equity program.
So should we add that as a?
I've got,
Second?
Can
I'm
I-
keeping score.
So I have 7 as well. Can I just go back to number 2? So does anyone have an objection to Commissioner Doyle's point to asking the staff for clarity on whether we can adjust priority?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with that. I just, it said to me, that's part of the issue. I'm not just unsure of the legality, I'm just unsure of what we're talking about in terms of what specific priority to what groups to what end. And so for me to react to this proposal, I want a little bit more clarity, not just on the legality, although certainly including legality, but my questions are broader than just that. I also, to Commissioner McBride's earlier comments, what is the total number of economic empowerment priority? We have 118?
123.
120, okay, and we have 4 that are completed and then the remainder is just, and how many did you say we're not even started, Commissioner McBride? 72. Before we give out additional priority to other groups or other persons, I really want to understand what's going on with those 72. And if it's, as Commissioner McBride speculated, I agree it's just pure speculation, some of them just are waiting until they have everything pulled together and then they feel like they've got work on.
Well, they're waiting for the licenses.
Well, whatever, yeah, waiting for
Don't
category
exist.
licenses.
We
Yeah, so my point is, until we kind of really understand that, I'm not sure how comfortable I am giving out priority to new applicants for new purposes. So I'd like to understand specifically what we're talking about here, not just legality, but I really want to understand what's going on with 120 plus that we've already given out.
I just want to be clear that I'm not speculating that they are, I want to know.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, that was bad choice of words, I apologize. There's any number of potential reasons why we see the distribution we've seen. I'd like to really understand that before we start talking about other priorities. But I'm more than happy, as a prelude, just in case we want to do that, since there's some lead time, ask the staff to look at the legality of that. Does that work?
I think that works, and I really appreciate the point that those 123 applicants, they were ready to go, they were paying attention, and we don't want to just dismiss them, of course. And so I think we want to do both of these. We want to examine what their barriers are, but we also want to start thinking about what else we can do for other applicants. I don't think they contradict each other.
No, I don't think so either. Okay, we'll move on to 3, please.
Yes, so number 3, this involves municipalities. I just want to quickly address Commissioner Flanagan's earlier point. This is not about Boston. This is about every single municipality, I think, that wants to work with us or is interested in this. So the idea is to create a single packet or abbreviated application process for economic empowerment applicants and equity program participants that takes place before the local approval process, specifically before the negotiation of the HCA. And the purpose of that idea, which came from municipal officials and staffers and others, is that if there is some initial vetting that takes place by the commission, it can provide a level of reliability to the localities who do want to encourage those groups.
So they want us to approve them before they go before the towns?
Not to approve them, but to initiate the process, to do partial approval.
I may be able to lend some,
I'm sorry?
I may be able to lend some color.
Please.
So in the medical process, it's a different sequence of events. You have an initial demonstration of capital, and then you're invited to the management operations profile. And not until you are invited to the siting profile, although hopefully applicants have been engaging prior to that time, it's not until that point in time that they have to demonstrate, that they have the proper property and that letter of support or non-opposition. So, what is being proposed here is more similar to what goes on in the medical process. It's obviously slightly different, but it's not unprecedented. It's just not how we did it. We did a completely flexible system.
This strikes me as another one that would be part of the regulatory process that we're going through, and so I can.
I'm, this is kind of a broader statement. My hope for and vision for this regulatory process, review process we're going through, is that it is broad. That, all good ideas, whether they're about the medical program, whether they're about the adult use program, whether they're about the equity program, we bring all good ideas to the table, because I don't want to go through the regulatory, I don't think any of us want to go through the regulatory review process too frequently. So I want to make sure that we have a very wide top of the funnel. So I would love to see this, incorporated in exactly, let's do some research to the legalities, the challenges, and discuss it as a potential draft regulation in the process that we're going through this year. So I support that completely. I don't know that I have an opinion on whether I support this or not, but I support the idea of talking about developing and debating draft regulation. So,
And this came from the towns that want to work with it? This came from multiple towns, or the towns that are open to applicants?
Both. It came from multiple towns, and it also came independently from staff discussions.
I'm sorry.
I would rather do this through the regulatory discussions.
That's what I think I just proposed that. So, is that okay? So, move on to number 4.
But first, Mr. Chairman, may I pause and ask Mr. Collins a question?
Yes, as long as you call him Mr. Executive Director, pretty formal around here.
All right, Mr. Executive Director, first, do you have any substantive feedback? It's fine if you don't at this point. But secondly, are you comfortable with this process of looking into each of these 7 ideas and reporting back to us on the feasibility?
So I guess I'll start with the kind of concept of the review and the evaluation. I think that's something that staff would obviously be glad to do. I guess I just want to be realistic in setting your expectations of how quickly we can turn some of these things around. So there's been some discussion about incorporating a lot of this into the regulatory review process. I think that's certainly an appropriate time frame.
I think that there's 2 that we specifically said we would. Go ahead, I'm sorry. I'll parse it after you get done.
So the example of the abbreviated packet or application, I think is something we can certainly consider. It would likely require a regulatory change. The other conversations I would certainly engage in internally among staff would be our licensing team, but also reaching out to our vendors to see how quickly we could turn something like this around. As I'm processing this, I'm thinking of the kind of the myriad of projects that we proposed, including the attempting to streamline the application process across both programs, adult use and medical. So I think the timeliness of this is appropriate and something we can incorporate. As far as the legal analysis, to your point of getting that done, but also sharing it broadly amongst the entire commission. So there's something to discuss often. So to the chairman's earlier point of reviewing whether or not it should be done, I think the first question we'd like to answer is, could it be done? And the should is certainly something that's preserved at the commission level. So that would be kind of my process reaction of, we're capable of doing a lot of things, and for me, it's just a question of being honest with the 5 of you about the process and expectations of how quickly we could turn something around. So I don't have that answer unfortunately today, but I think we can prioritize it.
And I take pretty good, so, at the end of this conversation, I'll go through and make sure that I've heard everything and we have all, because I only have 6, you have 7, so we just need to make sure that we're all on the same page, but so keep going, if we could, on number 4.
Yes. And so number 4, which I'm hoping that you weren't including on.
Yeah, no, I thought I saw my initials next to this one.
Is to issue formal recommendations to the legislature addressing the creation of grant programs for interest-free loan programs for equity program participants. And I think the recommendations should take into account how other agencies who do similar work structure them, and also perhaps make a recommendation as to what the appropriate agency would be.
I would be delighted to do that if you support it, I'd be delighted to do that. Or take the lead on that, obviously. Yeah,
I thought we were getting staff.
yeah, let's leave that for a second. I mean, I think that's certainly potential, but what I'd like to do is review my notes based upon the conversation we just had, but one step before that, are there other ideas that any commission wants to put on the table? And then we'll do what we've talked about, what we agreed to in next steps, including ownership. And let me also propose, I'm sorry to interrupt the ideation. I am more than willing to get this list finalized today, agree on next steps, and put on the agenda for our next meeting, which I believe is March 7th. A continuation of this conversation just to give people some time. Rather than putting people on the spot and say, do you have any other ideas? I mean, I know we've all been thinking about this, but I think you proposed and led us through a structure, which is great. I wouldn't mind, letting people think about this and perhaps adding to this list at our next meeting. Go ahead, Commissioner.
Mr. Chairman, I guess at this point, my big question is, what is the end goal here? Because if we're going to keep putting it on agendas going forward, like we just said, number 2 is a regulatory thing, or number 1 is a regulatory thing.
Right.
If that's gonna happen far in advance, we don't need to do this in 2 weeks and have this conversation again in 2 weeks. So I guess my question is.
I'm not suggesting we have the conversation. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
My question is, what is the end goal? Is it to create a list, figure out who takes ownership, whether it be staff or commissioners or department heads, move forward, figure out what's regulatory, and that's gonna happen during our regulatory discussions, figure out what's process and what can we do without having to take votes or do whatever. I'm a little confused as the plan. What's the path?
My plan or my proposal is that I thought, not quite finished yet, but I think we've had a really constructive conversation today. I said in my comments, in response to Commissioner Kyle's proposal, I said, citing the disagreement about whether we needed a course correction or not, my comment was, this is really hard, and I welcome all and any ideas to make it, probably can't make it less hard, but gives us a greater probability of success. So I think we just came up with some ideas. It seems like there was an agreement amongst the commission that there's the path forward. We haven't agreed to anything other than a path forward on these ideas. And all I'm doing is trying to take the pressure off of the other commissioners to come up with other ideas, and give them some time to think about that. I'm not proposing we do this every meeting. I am proposing we do it one more time at our next meeting just to see if there are any additional ideas that other commissioners want to put on the table. So that I don't think this is something that is going to be every commission meeting, but I want to just give people a little time to reflect on this conversation and perhaps come up with some other ideas, or perhaps not, but rather than put pressure on, because I don't feel right now, just talking about myself, I don't feel I'm in a position to say, well, I have other ideas. I'd really like to think about it. I think these are great ideas, but I'd like to think about it if there's anything else.
Yeah,
Commissioner Doyle?
Sure, I don't have an objection to that. Honestly, I'm already pursuing the things, we submitted in July and again in December, reports to the legislature flagging certain issues and respectfully asking for them to consider them. So there are ongoing things
Absolutely.
happening anyway, so I don't know that I have any additional ideas down the road.
Yeah, but I would ask you, we can put it on the agenda for the 7th, March 17th. If there's no additional ideas, that's fine, but I would just like to give people time. So I'm gonna, put it on the agenda and see what we can come up with. And these are great, these are worthwhile things, at least in my opinion, to pursue. So even if we put it on the agenda the 7th and nobody has any great new ideas, I think we're still gonna be doing some really important things. So I still only have 6. So let me read my list and what I think are the next steps and see what I've missed. So the first is, I guess in the order they came up, a study of barriers. I understand there is an SOW that is in development under a state contract. I don't know who is driving that, Mr. Executive Director, but I'd love to see that brought to the commission at the appropriate time, hopefully not too far down the road. Is that a fair request? Okay, so that's one. Second was outreach outside of Boston. Is that something that we should ask our Director of Community Outreach to?
No, I had asked for like an analysis of where they've been, like looking at the gap, like
Yeah.
a whole, analysis.
So, can we just leave that with you, or, yeah, okay, so that's two. Third is, data collection on ancillary business participation. That's something that we need to ask our Director of Research. Again, I'm not gonna, Sean, Mr. Executive Director, I'm gonna ask you just to say this is something that the staff will follow up on, how it's done with, by whom is obviously your discretion. Okay, so that's the third thing, is the data collection on ancillary business participation. Fourth was the regulation with respect to shared use for cultivation and manufacturing space, and we agreed that would be something that would be considered as part of our regulatory review process, starting with feasibility on analysis, with the idea that it would be part of our discussion in the timeframe that we're reviewing potential draft regulations. Did I get that right?
I think you got it right. I just wanna, add that the point of asking the staff to weigh in, I know there, as Commissioner earlier said, there are people on the staff who know way more about this than us. And the idea is to give a chance to come back before draft regulations need to be written and say, here's another way you could do it, here's why it's feasible, here's why it's not feasible, just to give the staff a chance to weigh in.
Okay. That's for Commissioner, Director.
Just with process different, what I would envision, and I guess I'm curious if it meets with the commission's approval, is a process similar to that of social consumption delivery, where a memo will be presented, which identifies, knowing this is a DS license, this is a model from California, some pros and cons of that process as we can discover it. But also, I think the question I would like to answer is how we would thoughtfully implement that potentially in Massachusetts, given the myriad of things that were identified as not so much hurdles or problems, but just ways we would accommodate that, given our either existing regulations or what might need to be modified. So, but a process similar to that, that will be presented.
That's worse for me. Everybody else comfortable with that? Okay, so that's 4. Am I keeping scoring correctly? 5 is a 2-part thing, but it's starting with an analysis of the legality of creating new priority statuses for different groups. Whether we do that through regulation or do we require legislative change? Mr. Executive, so that's 5. 6 is, I guess there are 7, I apologize. No, it's 5, yep, there's 7. The same thing we just described with respect to shared use, the same regulatory process with respect to the idea of a single packet, kind of pre-application prior to getting final municipal approval. And Commissioner Doyle, this is the same bracket, abbreviated application process for economic power applicants that takes place before local approval process. It's the third thing that Commissioner Title talked about.
Yes, no, I'm sorry, my confusion was I thought you just said shared use.
No, I said the approach we just talked about for shared use, take a similar approach with respect to this, asking for a staff memo on this. Is that okay with everybody? Mr. Executive Director, you puzzled or troubled or?
Never troubled.
Never troubled. Always a smile, that's what I like about you. So that was 6, and unfortunately, I hate to concede that Commissioner Shadow was correct and I was incorrect. Number 7 is the idea of developing formal regulations or formal recommendations to the legislature about funding for these candidates. And that one I would certainly ask for some help from the staff, but I'm more than happy to take the lead on as Commissioner Title requested. Obviously, I'm not going to the legislature and asking for anything until we come back and discuss it and agree upon it as a commission. And I get Commissioner Flanagan's sanity check saying, you can't do that. You can't ask for this.
Sometimes you gotta protect you from yourself, Mr. Chairman.
In fact, you're allowed to do so. So that's 7. Did I miss anything? I do want to give everybody some time to soak this in, and so I will ask, or not ask, I guess this is one thing I actually can do. I will put this on the agenda for the next meeting, but it'll be a short conversation, but I do ask people to soak this in and, think about other ideas. I do think that the messaging is really important, so I hope that we didn't, I wasn't trying to argue with you in terms of Commissioner Kyle with respect to course correction, but I actually think a lot of the messaging is really important. We are early, we're doing a lot of things. I think these are great ideas and great additions, but we're doing a lot of things. And I think I've said this to you personally, I'm completely confident we're gonna get this right. I think it's just gonna take a while, and it's really hard, but I'm completely confident. I'm now even more confident because I think we're doing some other things. So I think that message that the commitment, the energy, the effort that's going on is really important that we communicate broadly. So, any other comments on this topic?
Just so I'm clear.
Yes.
So we're moving forward with the 7 as discussed,
I think,
but
yes.
we are putting an agenda item on the next meeting, just in case people come up with other ideas.
Correct. Okay. Let me put up the next meeting schedule. So we have an advisory board meeting on February 26th, 1 p.m. at DOT. Last I saw this slide, this was tentative. That is now finalized, Mr. Executive Director?
Yes.
Okay, so 1 p.m., February 26th, next advisory board meeting. The next Cannabis Control Commission meeting, as I mentioned, is March 7th at 1 p.m. We're back over at with our friends at DOT. And then as part of the regulatory process that we refer to very frequently during this conversation, one of the first steps in that regulatory process is public listening sessions. We have 2 that are now scheduled. Thank you, Eric Micheli, and I guess Anne Marie Hall for getting the logistics worked out here. So we have 2 of them. They're back-to-back. One is on the 12th of March at New England School of Law, and one is on the 13th of March back here at the Gaming Commission. There being no further business in front of the commission, I would like a motion to adjourn, please.
So moved.
Have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Let's show we adjourned at 2:42 on February 21st. Thank you very much.